All right, we're back here for game one, revealing Karuga with our Calibrated Blast deck. And we have an opening hand of a couple of Scions, a Calibrated Blast, the ability to get Domain. So, hand is pretty simple. A little bit difficult to execute in terms of your land choices. Our opponent leads on Dragon Rage's Channeler, get our Bantley in, get our Thing, cast our Scion, mainly as a distraction to force our opponent to interact with that. Our opponent does nothing. We just attack. Opponent does nothing. We pass. They fetch. We Calibrated Blast in response, hoping for a 15 ball. And the opponent's dead. We revealed an Emrakul. That's an easy way to beat Izzet Murktide game one. However, they could have easily had Spell Pierce there. Nothing too interesting about this game, but let's move on to sideboarding. Now, sideboarding, we boarded in our copies of the original Boseiju, who shelters all, and boarded out some of our other utility lands. Potentially could have boarded in more answers to Blood Moon like Boseiju and Nawaru, but we generally don't care if our opponent is Blood Mooning us. Taking a look at our opening hand here, we have 6 lands and an Emrakul, not really where we want to be. We have a Calibrated Blast, we have a Boseiju, seems like a pretty reasonable hand overall. Can easily put back one of the Ramenap Ruins. And our opponent has nothing. Turn 1, Boseiju, go! Turn 2, probably a Ledger Shredder here. Ledger Shredder with Mishra's Bauble, nope. We draw Shadow of Mortality. Opponent expressively iterates. Gets to smack us for 1. Doesn't have another land. Can't play any more spells. We go ahead and Calibrate Blast. They can't do anything about it. We dome them for 15, revealing an Autochron Worm. Opponent plays a Dragon Rage's Channeler and passes. Now we just have to try to draw into enough mana before our opponent can kill us. We put Krug in our hand. Could have potentially activated Sukenzen, but our opponent does the monkey thing. Hits us for 3. And now we're just going to untap and kill them with a uncounterable Sunscorched Desert does the thing. And then no matter what we hit with Calibrated Blast, our opponent is dead. So, you know, we could have even potentially closed out the game if we'd gone Sukenzen last turn and activate Ramenap Ruins. It's one of the things with this deck is you definitely need to connect with the first copy of Calibrated Blast, hit a 15 ball, and then from there your lands can sometimes close out the game. But the important thing about this hand is our opponent didn't have enough pressure to shut off our Boseiju. If our opponent had a faster start, or if we'd been a little bit clunkier, these damage from Boseiju can add up. So that is something to consider when you're up against Murktide, is whether you'll be able to use Boseiju enough times to close out the game. So generally when I'm doing these replay things for games, rather than just straight up gameplay as I'm live recording, I generally don't like to play the same matchup, especially in a 5-match set, back to back. But with Murktide in particular, I wanted to illustrate the point that I was talking about with Boseiju. So I do believe in this match that does come up. So figure this is kind of an interesting matchup. So as much as you can get with Calibrated Blast anyway. We are on the play. Our opening hand does nothing, so we have to mulligan. This hand also does nothing, so we have to mulligan. This hand finally does stuff, but we're on a mull of 4, so we can't keep the Scion. Ideally, we'd like to keep like Calibrated Blast, 3 lands, Scion, and ditch the Emrakuls. But overall, I do think there is reason to keep this hand. Obviously, Calibrated Blast against an unknown opponent. Obviously, I kind of spoiled it. This is Murktide, but in the dark, you don't know that when you're mulliganing for game number 1. Pitch all the creatures, get all of our lands, pass turn. Opponent leads on Steam Vents, Dragon Rage's Channeler. Obviously, this could still be something like Breach, but it's most like a Murktide with this opening. And once again, it's playing around counter spells. Our opponent does the thing, hits us for that. We get to fetch. I believe we have Domain at this point, so we just pass. If our opponent ever uses any mana, we go ahead and let them consider. Dangerous there. They have the Spell Pierce. Unlike our round 1 opponent, it did not. So, alright. And at this point, we're probably a huge dog in this game because our first Calibrated Blast didn't resolve. We cast a Scion and pass. Our opponent has a Dress Down, which is whatever. It makes those things a 4/4. They pass. They bobble. Once again, this still seems a little bit weird that they Dress Down, but whatever. We draw an Emrakul, which does us nothing. Opponent has Unholy Heat. And then from here, we're just in a world of trouble because we're probably never resolving another copy of Calibrated Blast. And even if we resolve one currently, it just isn't enough. Opponent swings. Looks like they were going to cast a Murktide. They cast a Murktide. They have Pressure plus Disruption. Generally a winning recipe against combo decks such as Calibrated Blast. And we draw a Rafine's Tower and pack it in. By boarding, on the play, board out our Gemstone Caverns, board in our old school Besages. Go ahead and take a look at our opening hand. We have pretty much everything we could want. We have a Besaju, we have a Calibrated Blast, so I think this is a pretty easy keep on 7. Obviously, the Emrakul is kind of whatevs, but we also have Halimar Depths, potentially stack our deck. Our opponent gets to do the thing here. They play our Ragavan. We get to play Halimar Depths, kind of manipulate what they're able to put on top of their deck. It's all going to be a bunch of lands anyway. So one thing we could potentially have done here is lead on or have crack the Scalding Tarns. Now our opponent plays a Blood Moon here, which is interesting. I don't think it's a good strategy overall against us. Now obviously our opponent gets to do the thing here. We draw another Calibrated Blast, so we're just going to get to overload their counter spells. We let them consider. I could have potentially Calibrated Blast there, but I really wanted to stretch their mana as much as possible when it comes to end step into untap. So this is kind of the game you have to play against them. I still don't think Blood Moon is a particularly good card against us. Sure, it shuts off Besaju, but I think our opponent is more advantaged. But gotta do what you gotta do, I suppose. This puts them to -14. So once again, Blood Moon strategically makes some sense, but it just, I don't think, does enough in this matchup. It does, yes, shut down some of your utility lands, but I guess if you don't have a whole lot to bring in against a deck that your Bolts and Unholy Heats are pretty useless against, gotta do what you gotta do. Alright, sideboarding again. Board out some of our random utility lands. Continue to bring the Gemstone Caverns back in. We have a pretty reasonable hand here. Well, actually not. This is a mulligan. If we were on the draw, this hand would be fine, or it is on fine, but we have no Calibrated Blast or Throes of Chaos, so we have to throw it back. This one has a Calibrated Blast, but no way to make it uncounterable, but I still think it's a hand we have to keep. And back the Alakram Worm. Opponent does nothing. We play our Triland. Opponent plays a tapping out here, obviously, when they know we can't do anything. So, okay. Blood Moon, fetch. We should probably fetch in response here. Get that. Float mana. Blood Visage of the Blood Moon, which is not the best because we could have gotten a free Calibrated Blast off. So we fetch that. Calibrated Blast. They have the Spell Pierce. So now they just get to clock us out. So I guess the Besaju part doesn't come up, but it also does show you here that would be at like 8, and this would put us to like 4. So we'd be very limited on the amount of Besajus that we'd have access to, Besaju activations. But that's kind of the start they have to have, is the aggression plus the disruption. Because, you know, if you're given infinite time, you will find a Besaju and just blast them in the face. But, you know, that is one of the things with Calibrated Blast, is you do have counters to basically everything with your lands, which seems weird, but you also don't have infinite time, and they all have some cost of utility. All right, we are here with our third and final match in our playthrough with Calibrated Blast. Now, obviously, this is picked of the 5 matches from a league. I generally only pick ones that are interesting or trying to prove a point. I think overall we went 3-2 in the league. So Calibrated Blast is a very linear deck with what it does. It's do the thing, either try to do the thing again, or finish you off with lands, or Scion of Draco. It has a little bit of speed boost with Gemstone Caverns on the draw, has a little bit of protection from counterspells with Besaju, and the fact that the combo is instant speed, or resilience because of Throes of Chaos. You have Nephalia Academy against discard spells. Deck isn't terribly interesting in terms of a lot of its decisions. That's why it's probably its most interesting matchups are the tempo matchups, you know, Jeskai Breach, Izzet Murktide, etc. Possibly even something like Blue-White Control, although with infinite time against that deck, the fact that they have no clock, you're probably a little bit better off than you are against the tempo decks. That said, we are going into the third match, and this one will be Jeskai Breach, a slightly different variant on what Murktide presents. In this matchup, especially in Game 1, you're not face down with actual hard counter spells, but you are hit with things like Spell Pierce, backed up by, you know, Ledger Shredders, Ragavans, DRCs, plus the overwhelming closure of Breach. So we take a look at our opening hand, and we have Blast, plus a bunch of lands, reasonable keep. Opponent reveals Gigantha, so we know we're not up against Murktide. Opponent plays their land, no pressure. We go ahead and fetch, getting the Bant land, draw another fetch land. This will enable us to cast Scion of Draco. Our opponent has nothing, continues to do nothing. Okay, plays a DRC. We have a Besaju, but we go ahead and Sunscorch them, swing for 4. Opponent does nothing. Still a very curious hand. They bolt. Sure. They Unholy Heat. Sure. Opponent gets to swing in here. Opponent, importantly, never takes their shields down, which is annoying. But if they would have ever taken their, or gone to fetch there, we could potentially have gotten them with Calibrated Blast. So we do the thing. We only hit them for 4, which kind of sucks because we were able to play around Spell Pierce. Opponent does the Ragavan thing. They hit us for 4. They play Underworld Breach. Really do nothing with it. I guess they were trying to turn on Delirium. So we go for Calibrated Blast. Now I could potentially have tried to wait one more turn to play around 1 Spell Pierce, which may have been correct, but we were getting pretty close to dying here. As we know, they have Monkey in their hand, and that's 5 damage. Bolt would be dead. Or no, not quite dead. They swing with Monkey, do the thing. They have a Scion. We pass, don't draw the Calibrated Blast. If we'd waited another turn, it's possible we would have won this game. So something to consider whenever, you know, knowing what you're playing against. Obviously, your opponent doesn't generally have counter spells in their deck outside of Spell Pierce, but it is something to consider. And on to game number 2. All right, game number 2, we are on the play. We reveal Kruga, etc. Opening hand does nothing. This hand has Resiliency plus Boseiju. Put back the Shadow of Mortality and keep. Lead off on Boseiju here. Potentially could have led off on one of these to get one of the tri-lands in case we drew Scion of Draco, but just go ahead and do that. Do Monkey Go. Opponent hits us for 1. Once again, still representing Spell Pierce. The Spell Pierce is particularly interesting here. We go ahead and run that out. I'm not even sure why I just didn't do this main phase. I guess it doesn't particularly matter. If our opponent taps out here, they could potentially die because of Throes of Chaos. But they hit us for 3 here. We go ahead and blast them. Calibrated Blast on the stack. Hit them for 15, revealing that. This is where it gets dangerous, because Throes of Chaos itself is uncounterable, but that doesn't matter. And our opponent scoops, so I guess they didn't have a Spell Pierce. I guess they were just relying on the ability to counter it. We did bring in Crime Punishment simply because their deck is so low to the ground. It's not inconceivable for us on turn 3 to Punishment for 1, blow up most of their sources of pressure, buy ourselves a lot of time, and it still is a 8 damage flip. So on to game number 3. Alright, game number 3, taking a look at our opening hand. We have Boseiju, 1 land Boseiju, so it's a little bit of a risk. On the draw especially, this hand is a bit of a clunker, but you know, you really can't pitch a hand with these two. Just kind of hope to draw lands, and when you're playing 38 lands, you're thinking you're going to draw some lands at some point, right? Or even 34, 35 with Crime Punishments on the deck over some of the lands. We just play that. Opponent hits us for damage. We play a Boseiju and pass. Opponent bolts our face. They understand the assignment. The assignment is get us dead. They play Expressive Iteration. Getting a Spire Bluff Canal. They once again understand the assignment. We draw land. I kind of screwed up here. So what I should have done was grab a green source and punishment here away their pressure, because this puts me to 10, from 10 to 8, and then we Calibrated Blast, but now we're just dead to these guys if they happen to have a bolt. So I should have grabbed either our green source and just punished this nonsense away. Would have bought us potentially infinite time, especially with these Boseijus. But instead, I went for the losing line, and our opponent was not able to punish us, but we can't cast anything because I screwed up on my fetching and went for the wrong line. So this is certainly a game we could have won and easily been 4-1 in the league. But, you know, I did show you the two of the two losses, but I really wanted to illustrate the point of pressure plus disruption is always the best thing against counterspell or against combo decks, because given time, combo decks will find a way to overcome any type of disruption. They're generally built to beat disruption in post-board games, unless you're a deck like the old Neoform combo, the old Oops All Spells, but even those decks had access to things like Defense Grid, Veil of Summer, etc. If you give your opponent the time, you're going to find a way around your strategy. So, pressure plus disruption is the key to beating this deck. That said, Calibrated Blast, we'll talk about it in the wrap one sec. Now, I could do a deck tech on Calibrated Blast, but we've already done a deck overview. It'll be in the same playlist as this. So if you want a more in-depth thing of what the deck does, check that out. But the deck has counterplay to everything. You have Gemstone Caverns to speed you up, potentially allowing a turn 2 Calibrated Blast, untap turn 3 Calibrated Blast, kill your opponent. Okay, have the speed and angle covered. We have Sign of Draco as an alternative threat. We have, 12 of the, 18 or 20 hits are 15 damage guaranteed. Another 4 or 12 damage. So you have 12 of 16, 18, 22. You have over half your hits deal for 10 plus damage. Your land base does a bunch of stuff. You have your Scavenger Grounds, your Sun-Scorched Deserts. You have your Ramanap Ruins to close out on damage. You have your copies of Sekenzen as additional threats. And then you have your Besejus and your Otawaros to answer things like Blood Moon or Leyline of Sanctity. Sideboard, you have more copies of Otawara and Beseju for, once again, Leyline of Sanctity, potentially Blood Moon, but mainly those. Nephalia Academy is kind of your anti-discard spell outlet. Allows you to put it back on top of your deck rather than in the graveyard. Beseju, who shelters all, is your way to get on counter spells. Now, what do these all have in common? If your opponent is backing their disruption up with pressure, it's a lot harder for you to find your answers. Much like a deck like Lotus Field Combo in the Pioneer format, if you don't back up your disruption with pressure, the opponent will find a way to fight through your hate. They are built to fight through that. That's why the tempo decks are so effective against this. There are some decks out there that have the turn 2, turn 3 kills. Decks like Hammer Time, the newer builds of Amulet with the new Mycosynth Gardens, I believe it is, out of Phyrexia All Will Be One. So there's a lot going on in the format that kind of shook up maybe where Calibrated Blast is capable of, but it's a little bit more resilient than a deck like Glimpse, or the All-In Glimpse deck, but still very powerful. A lot of people would complain it's very linear with what it does. It's vulnerable to extraction effects. Sure, all that's true. But if you just want to have a deck that goes pow sometimes, this is kind of the deck for you. But we already kind of covered it in the deck overview. Just kind of wanted to give a rundown of why we chose the games we did in the league. But, a little bit of rundown of what the deck does. And the counterplay to a lot of things. So don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hope to see you for the next video.